Media Minds brings voices together by inviting leaders and thinkers from the region to join in on a larger national conversation about advertising, communications, and public relations. This is the Media Minds of Sacramento podcast.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Christy Pierce. I am the Media Minds host of Sacramento, your local podcast here that brings the thinkers and leaders together in an area to have a conversation about media, advertising, communications, PR, but all things in the industry, and bringing in experts in our field to have conversations about that. So this morning, I'm excited to bring in our next guest, our second guest, and it feels like it's been a long gap in between, almost, 9 months since our inaugural episode. A little thing called COVID-19 happened, which put a pin on a lot of this. So super excited to bring you on board, Damien Barling, one of our multimedia leaders and experts here in Sacramento. You've got over 17 years of experience in the industry across TV, radio, podcasting, and a gamut of other things. And we're super excited to have you join us today to share some knowledge.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I look forward to this conversation for sure.
We've been pushing things back because we've had a little bit of a rain delay, let's call it that, where a lot of Sacramento's power's been out. So we've been dancing and dodging tree limbs as they've been falling. And I appreciate you being able to hop on and make this happen. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Like we can't get together in person. We're having trouble getting together virtually now. It's like they're just throwing all sorts of objects at us to try to dodge and keep our movement going here. It
does help with that creativity. You know, how do we fix and solve this next problem of communication?
Right.
We can't get together, we can't get online, but what's next? You know?
Yeah.
Superpowers. That's where we're going.
That's about where we're at. That's pretty much it.
Marvel Universe is where we're going next.
Yeah.
Well, great. So I'm super excited to talk about a few things with you. But before we get into some of the topics for today, tell me something good. Tell me something good that's inspired you or it's moved you in the last week. A bit of hope it's been some sunshine on your shoulders.
Sure. Well, as we'll talk about, one of the things that we do with BeHeard is a podcast platform, and it gives people an opportunity who are interested in media, particularly of the audio form. Though they're pretty much all media now is kind of multimedia journalism, in that if you're a radio show host, like that's really cool, but that's not going to be your only job anymore. You've got to know how to do live streams. You got to know how to do video streams. You got to know how to do social media. You got to know how to do all of those things. So when we work with people in BeHeard, we really stress that, what we're doing isn't just, long form conversations and podcasting. That's obviously a very important part of what we're doing, but how are people going to know that you exist? How are people going to know that this podcast is out there? How are people going to know that this podcast is for them? And just over the last 10 days or so, we've launched 2 podcasts that we're really excited about. One called Uncultured Bias, which is hosted by a close friend of mine, Kamara Williams, who's from Sacramento. I met him 20 years ago at American River College, and he's gone on to be a prominent lawyer. He's in Orlando right now, but he's very tuned into the national political scope as well as the local political scope. And he's been on my podcast on a number of occasions, and he was a guy that people said, he really should have his own podcast. He really should have his own podcast. So I finally talked him into doing it. He launched his own website that has his own blog on it, his political musings, if you will. And he launched his podcast, which is just going really, really well. And we talked about the importance of consistency. That's another thing about podcasting, is people have to know that you're going to be there. And he ran with that to a whole different degree. Instead of doing it, once a month, or once a week, he's doing it once every couple of days. Like anytime there's a political story that comes out, he turns on his computer and he starts talking, and he puts that podcast out there. And to watch its growth just over the first 5 or 6 episodes has been really exciting. And just a couple of days ago, we launched another one called Sandbox Sisters, which is 3 friends who grew up together. Kendra Montgomery Block, who is very in tune with stuff here. She works for the Sierra Health Foundation, and she has a variety of different, projects, including Build Black and Black Child Legacy here in Sacramento. She has started a podcast with her 2 best friends who she's known since the 4th grade. And she kind of ran the idea by me, and she had gotten really comfortable because we do the Build Black podcast together. So she had gotten really comfortable kind of in the podcast conversational form, but this was going to be her first shot at hosting it and guiding it. and she has done just an absolutely terrific job. So to see the response to those two podcasts, which are geared towards the audiences that we're targeting with BeHeard, that was the whole point of creating this platform. It's been pretty exciting the last couple of days to see that.
It's funny how some people, they're not really shown or exposed to certain types of multimedia, but the moment you get in front of them, or the moment media gets in front of them, they're naturals, and they just know how to make it work. And I feel like, like for me, it takes me 9 months to figure out what my next topic is sometimes. So I'm the opposite end of that spectrum. So it's exciting to hear, people that, like you said, who maybe didn't have a platform are now finding ways to make sure that their voices, who are active voices in conversations, have a larger audience. And I think it's a good segue to talk a little bit more about the BeHeard platform that you've created, and really what it is, and how it started. And it might be a bit of a story to get to that, because I know obviously, you didn't wake up one night and just discover this and need for it. You've been in this industry for a while and noticed elements along the way that kind of ultimately brought you to this point. So I think looking back, how you got started in the industry, you walk us through that story. Like, how did you first get involved? What was your first calling to want to get into media, into multimedia, and to where you are today? Then ultimately, obviously, what brought forth this new platform.
Yeah, it's and thank you, because that's my entry into the business is why BeHeard was created. I had I always loved music. Like, music was my first love, and sports were probably my second. When I was younger, it probably the hierarchy might have been like professional wrestling, then music, then sports. Like, sports was a lot lower on the totem pole, but I loved like music, and I have zero musical talent. Like, I can't sing. Like, I never learned how to play instruments or anything like that. But I used to listen to music, and I would listen to the radio for hours and hours and hours on end. There was probably a stretch of like 3 or 4 years where I would wear out every Walkman I got. I know people probably forgot what a Walkman was, but I wore those things out, falling asleep to the radio every night. And my high school had a radio station. So you kind of learn the intricacies a little bit. It's certainly not, at the time, it certainly wasn't a professional radio station, but you did learn a lot about running a radio station. You learned about the importance of commercials. You learned about the FCC rules and all of those sorts of different things. And when I finished high school in 1998, I was, it was go to junior college a couple of years, and I'm going to go to Sac State, go through their business program, get my degree, and God, I'll figure it out there at some point. Well, I got to American River College, and I just desperately missed radio. And so I applied for an internship. And my first interview was with the station out here in Sacramento. It's basically an old school hip hop station now. Then it was more like an oldies type station, V101.1. And V101.1 is a sister station to KFBK. Well, my internship interview was on September 11, 2001.
Oh, geez.
So think about how that might have gone there for a second, walking into a radio station that's home of a news channel. So I walked in, and I'm sure they I'm sure they just forgot to cancel the interview because nobody was thinking about internship interviews. So I walked in, and it's everything you'd imagine. It's chaos. Like, there are people running around everywhere. You can hear news streaming. You can hear, TVs, multiple TVs, all with the volume turned up, people trying to get information. So I walked in, and they did do the interview. I'm confident they have zero recollection of me ever walking through those doors. I never heard from them again. And it was about a month later that I interviewed with KSFM 102.5, which is a heritage hip hop and R&B radio station out here. And they hired me, I was an intern, of course, like, I'm working for free. So they're like, yeah, come on. And it was kind of there that the process started, where when you come in as an intern, you're like hanging up banners and, handing out CDs and bumper stickers and all of that stuff. And it's like, yeah, this isn't what I want to do. Like, this is cool, but this isn't what I want to do. And I asked Big Al, who was the midday host there, I said, hey, this is great and all, but I want to learn what you do. He was like, okay, well, let me get permission from our program director. His name is Byron Kennedy, and we'll see if we can get you in like once a week or something like that, or whatever your schedule allows. And so at the time I was available on Mondays, and he was like, okay, come in every Monday. And that's what I started to do. And I did that for just months and months and months. And I didn't turn down anything. If they wanted, I wanted to learn everything about the radio station. So I learned how to do commercials. I learned how to read commercials. I learned how to do like imaging. There was nothing, at least in the realm of 2001, 2002 radio, that I didn't learn to do. And I eventually, after, months of kind of trying to figure this out, I asked my program director, I said, hey, can I get a shot like on the air? And he goes, okay, no problem. I'll put you on at 3 a.m. Sunday morning. You'll be on from 3 to 6 a.m. And, we'll go over your air check at some point, and, we'll work from there. So I do the 3 to 6 show, and it just happens to be on a Sunday he's going golfing. So he's up at 5 a.m. And anybody in radio knows there's a hotline, which normally involves like an emergency light flash to let you know that you need whatever you're doing, drop what you're doing and answer the phone. And so 5 a.m., that light goes off, and I'm like, well, this is it. It was a good 2 hours, but here we go. And I answered the phone. He said, hey, how's it going? I was like, well, I don't know. You're up. You tell me. He was like, I'm pleasantly surprised. It's like, oh, okay. He was like, yeah, I didn't think you'd be good at this. You're very like monotoned and like really chill in the hallway. Like, I didn't think you'd have the personality for this, but for some reason, when the light goes on, you seem to like turn it on a little bit. And I was like, oh, great. And so from day one, and I've heard that air check before, it's awful. I don't know what he heard, but it is bad. But he day one after that, that 5 a.m. call, he believed in me. And so I think more than anything, he believed in my work ethic. So when I was hired, when I went from internship to being hired, I was already bored at American River College. I was already taking classes that didn't amount to an associate degree and transferring to Sac State. Like, I had started doing the little checklist that you're supposed to do, and this will get you on track for what you want to do at Sac State. And it was like, this sucks. Like, give me like 3 business management courses over here. Give me these 2 African-American study classes over here. And then just the hell with the rest of it. Cause like I'm going to school now to learn rather than to get a degree. And so by that point I was like, okay, I'm getting paid. I'm done. I finished the semester, and I soaked everything I had into working. Because I don't know if this will come up again, I did eventually get my bachelor's degree. I want to point that out. I don't encourage anybody to not get their degree. I eventually went back as like my career was going pretty comfortably. I finished my bachelor's degree. But at that time, it was, I need to soak everything into what I'm doing, and I need to soak everything into this business. And he let me, as a part-time employee, he let me log 60 hours a week. Like, he fought for me with, corporate and getting paid and all those sorts of different things. And I kept working, kept grinding. And those avenues, like every avenue that I just laid out, it doesn't exist anymore. Like, internships don't exist. Hell, part-time weekend people, which is where I started. Like, I started on Sunday nights. I eventually worked my way up to Saturday nights. Sunday afternoons, those type of kind of marquee weekend shifts, if you will, they don't exist anymore. Now they hire people who already work for the company, but might work in another market. So they bring them in to do weekends on the market. And all it is it's a voice track log. Like, it's put into a computer. Like, there's not even an actual person in the studio anymore. So the avenues that I use to get into radio no longer exist. And if internships weren't around in 2001, I never would have been at KSFM. I never would have, had a morning show there, and it never would have led me ultimately to ESPN 1320, where I'm at now. It would have never have led me to the sports talk realm, because I wouldn't have been able to get in. And that was one of my biggest frustrations with, when I came up with the idea for when BeHeard was born. It was born out of a conversation with Stacy Kaufman, who is my market manager for Intercom here in the Sacramento area. And it was in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And one of the things that I was really frustrated about, and I knew Stacy pretty well, so I felt comfortable sharing this with her, one of the things that I was really frustrated about was there was no representation on the radio, and there were hip hop stations, and now, they're dubbed pop stations, but the fact is it's Black music by Black artists, but it's not being celebrated by Black on-air personalities. And so we got into a conversation with that, and it led us down kind of the rabbit hole of, okay, we have an issue. How did we get to this issue? And as we dug further and further and further and further, we realized, okay, there's a bigger issue. And the bigger issue is people can't get into the business anymore. So even if you have a desire to be in media, even if you have a desire to be on the radio, like, there's no avenue for you anymore, because even working for free is no longer an option. And so that meeting was kind of the seeds of BeHeard. Like, what can we do to help people who want to have an avenue into the media business?
And you touched on a lot of really good bullet points there that I'm like, oh my God, I need to talk about that. I want to talk about that.
That was a really long answer. My sincerest apologies.
But it's great because you touched on, I think, three important things right off the bat. Is that in the very beginning, you asked, you're like, hey, I love doing this stuff, but I want to do this. You asked the people that you're working with closest to you, like, can I do this? And a lot of times I think, when you're a student or even you're not even sure where you want to go and you have an opportunity, fortunately you had an opportunity at least to get into the door. And obviously, like, nowadays internships are kind of completely changed. But if you know somebody, or if you're in an opportunity or a situation that is a little bit more of an opportunity, and you find yourself interested in something, you did the most important thing, which is just to ask to see if it's possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without that first question, you could have just been putting stickers up and posters, and that's all, and that could have all been all it was. And I'd done some of that stuff for AMP Energy when I was in college, and just putting up, posters and flyers and things. And
yeah,
I had that same, I think, thought, except I did the wrong thing and I didn't ask. I just did it for 6 months and I was done, and that was it. And it was like, thanks. And that's all I had. So I quickly learned, I'll take props later in life. They're like, yeah, you actually got to ask for what you want. And I still have that same problem myself today. It's just making sure that, we only learn when we ask others on what we're doing to how to be better at the end of the day. So
there's always that fear, because you can ask something and the answer can always be no. And it feels like rejection. So, it's a defense mechanism, right? Like, you don't want to deal. You felt like, well, this is unwarranted rejection. Like, how could they possibly think I want to come here and hang up posters and bumper stickers and all of that? Like, why would they think that? Obviously, they should know what I want to do for a living with my life. Like, they should know that I had a love for music. And so
I have this passion. Why don't you see it?
Yeah. Why don't you know that, as I'm handing this bumper sticker to the 4,000th listener who actually came to see the radio personality and not me? So yeah, I think we do that because it's just a defense mechanism.
Well, and most of life is rejection, right? So it's just part of that getting comfortable being uncomfortable element.
Yeah.
Really asking those questions. But the other part of that is, having someone to actually believe in you. And I'm sure you know this better than anybody. There's nothing more humbling than hearing yourself on radio for the first time. Embarrassing, and that was my experience. It was just like, wow, I really shouldn't be on air because my voice is nasally and just weird.
Mm-hmm.
But you had someone who heard you and really believed in you, and that little bit of support and help goes miles and miles and miles, especially at a young age, because then you feel like, hey, there are opportunities as long as I ask or as long as I try. And I think in today's workforce, there isn't as much of that. Certainly this past year, it's even harder to ask or even to have and to find people that can give that type of experience to someone who's just starting out in the industry. And that's why mentorship is such an important element of any industry, is kind of giving that same experience back to someone, because we've all been there in one way, shape, or form. Maybe it didn't pan out necessarily the way that we thought or hoped, because maybe we got you're really not meant for, this position. Maybe you should try a different department. But, sometimes that snowballs into something else. And, you have those ping pong back and forth moments, right? Where you start to kind of finesse and figure out where is really your true path. And that changes, of course, all the time. Like you said, 10, 20 years ago, radio was a different landscape. And nowadays it's completely different. You need to have all these other tools in your toolkit, but you only get that far unless you kind of stumble your way and work with people that are also stumbling along the way and just need a hand or need help or need to struggle through it together. So I think that's an important message just for our listeners to ask, because you never know who's going to be able to receive that.
Well, to add like a little bit more to that, I mentioned, Stacy Kaufman, and I had said that I was comfortable, like we had a type of relationship where I could bring her my concerns and I think that she would receive them. And part of the reason for that is I had a radio show in 2018 that came to an end. Time is a weird thing. I think it was 2018. But, it's been 10 years since 2018. So God knows if that was actually the right time. And so I immediately went to work on like, okay, what am I going to do next? And I went to Intercom, and they had ESPN 1320 there. And ESPN 1320 was just programming coming out of Bristol, Connecticut, the main ESPN, studio. And it was nothing really local. There were no local tie-ins. It was kind of a station that they had, and they figured they could work with it. And it did well enough in the ratings, but it was nothing, that really fit what Intercom was, which is live and local content. And so I went to Stacy, and I wanted to revamp ESPN 1320. And I was kind of going through the channels of like going through the program director and, sending emails, and we were having, dialogue and all that. And I felt like I'm getting nowhere. So I knew Stacy was a health buff. So I sent her some Vibe health bar, like green juices. And the day it was delivered, she emailed me right away. She goes, you're really persistent. Like I want to talk to you. And she invited me, in to come meet her the following Monday. And she brought me in, and she was like, okay, listen, we're not doing anything with ESPN 1320. Like we're not, like, it doesn't make any money, and we have nothing to do with this. But I believe you're really persistent. You'd be a great salesperson, which was like I was just death to me. But I had a decision to make. Yeah, I had a decision to make. It was like, okay, you can shut the door on this, or you can take an offer from the market manager who can wind up putting you back on the air on the station that you want to work for. So I took the job as a salesperson. And man, again, a lot like Byron, she believed in me. A lot like Byron, I don't know why, but she did. And so, she took an interest in me. And one day she took me and a couple of other people out to lunch, and she was asking, what can we do better to like really help you? Like, we believe that you guys are strong young account executives who could be, phenomenal for here. And she's recommending these books. And one of them I think was called it's either the 10X theory or the 10X rule, something like that.
Grant Cardone, 10X.
Oh my bro. So you know what I'm talking about. It's about like multiplying your efforts to like sell and do all this stuff. And then so it motivated, like I listened to it in, a day and a half. It's a relatively easy listen, a relatively easy read. And so I listened to it, and I was like, I've been doing this all wrong. And I asked, to meet with her a couple of days later. And I had this whole plan for ESPN. Had nothing to do with selling, had nothing to do with being an account executive. It had to do with making that radio station more profitable for the company. And I laid out this whole plan. And if Stacy could have told me to get the hell out of her face and never, ever speak to her again, I think she would have. But she didn't. She indulged me, and she was just like, this isn't it. Like, I know you're trying, like, this doesn't help our company overall. I said, okay. And the one thing heading into that meeting is I wasn't sure how it was going to end. Was I just going to say okay and leave, or was I going to quit? And so it was actually a combination of both. I said, okay, I can tell this just isn't going anywhere with you and I. And we had like an hour blocked off, or maybe 30 minutes blocked off, and it was going way too long. And I knew she had other stuff to do. So I eventually, we left, and I left the account executive position like shortly thereafter. And I started working on podcasting and putting all of my efforts towards podcasting, but we stayed in contact. And shortly after that meeting regarding Vibe Health Bar, she told me that they had started to put together a plan for ESPN. And eventually I became a part of that plan. So to tie into what you were saying there.
She just took it and ran with it.
Eventually it took her a while to get out of the starting gate, but she eventually did. And, she hired a great program director who saw the vision of the radio station. He had his own vision for the radio station. And we kind of got together and put together this idea of how we can make, this station stronger for the company overall. But it goes back to what you were saying a minute ago. If you don't ask, like if you're not forward with what you want, I'd still be a failing account executive through COVID, getting, commission checks of $0 and 0 cents.
Yeah, and it's a big barrier because it's putting yourself out there at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so many different ways where that's daunting. Whether it's like personally, something personal you want to bring up, or professional, because we all have to learn and grow, and there's only one way to do that, and that's to fail forward, as they say. So I think it's an important theme that we all can wake up and remind ourselves with every day, because there's always something that could be an opportunity. We just have to ask for it sometimes. It's not always there. And that kind of brings me into a little bit more along the lines of mentorship, because obviously we're a body of one, and we have all the great thoughts, of course, going on in our heads, but without collaboration, without mentors to help us guide those thoughts, they sometimes can fall flat, or they don't reach the right ears. And I want to kind of get a little bit more peek into your experience, and who are those mentors in your life that really changed your perspective in the media that you've been involved in, and how are you working with BeHeard to kind of give that platform for up and comers to not only mentor others with their own voice, but have a platform to learn and grow as you have in your industry.
Well, in again, that's another really important part of BeHeard, because I didn't have mentors. I mean, the closest that I could come up, like the person that I learned the most from was Byron Kennedy. And until Stacy and my program director at ESPN, Danny, I wasn't sure anybody believed in me in the radio business besides Byron, because he was the one who hired me. And eventually, when I went from music playing radio to sports talk radio, he was the program director at the sports talk station too. So out of the 3 stations that I've worked for, he's hired me for 2 of those jobs. And there was a point where I was a salesperson going, maybe I never was good at radio. Like maybe all of those years I spent, maybe it was just smoke and mirrors and I wasn't actually good, or he was the only one who thought I was good at it. But I learned so much I learned so much about the business from him, because he's a workaholic. To a fault, he's a workaholic. But he is so like entrenched in the business. And he taught me like the intricacies of, you often, you spend hours, as I was doing before we got on this call, planning out the show. What are the topics you're going to talk about? What's the engaging content that your audience wants to hear? And that's the exciting stuff, right? That's the fun stuff. That's the creative stuff. But he taught me the importance of like a clock. He taught me the importance of going to a commercial on time. He taught me the importance of, why you can't go to commercials late. Or he taught me the importance of, going above and beyond for, sponsors and endorsers and different things like that. So in terms of like a mentor, he's the only one, because radio, then as I believe it is now, is still a really cutthroat business. And there are some really good people in radio, and then there's some like real dirtbags. Like there are people who will smile at you but lobby for your job behind your back. Like there are people who believe that because they've worked a certain amount of months or a certain amount of years that they deserve certain opportunities, ignoring the fact that they haven't had to perform on this grand scale. They've been working in like smaller realms. So like there are people who will lobby against you and politic against you, all the while smiling at you. And so we wanted to create a platform where people could get advice, get help, get leadership, get guidance that would take them to the next level without like the stress of someone politicking against them. Like we're trying to get some of these younger people hired. Like we have multiple different groups of people that we mentor. Some are like out of Sac State and have done the broadcasting program. And this is essentially an internship for them. We're trying to get them to the ESPNs and the KSFMs and the Ns and 98 Rock. And we're trying to get them into those stations. And then there's, the younger people who are more in the 15 to 16, 17-year-old range. We're working with them on like social media. So we're working with them on delivering a message. And we couldn't take, like when the original idea for BeHeard was the podcasting and the platform there. But then we met this group called Source Media, which is a part of the Sac Unified School District. And when we met them, which was I mean, we were contacted about them probably the day we put out the press release for BeHeard. And, you know, a big part of what we do with BeHeard is like our social engagement and our social issues. And so we were connected with them right away. I think we met with them on what was supposed to be a one-off 2-hour Zoom call. And we knew right away, okay, like this right here, that group we just met, that's what BeHeard is. Like the podcast platform is cool and we're going to continue to use it. But working with these young students, that's what we need to be about. And so we formulated a plan where we wind up, you know, sitting with them. You know, that one-off 2-hour Zoom call turned into a twice a month 2-hour Zoom call where we sit down and, you know, we put together projects, like we put together a vote like your life depends on it video. None of these people are old enough to vote, but this was the idea that they had. They came up with the idea of reenacting the Fight the Power video from Public Enemy. We let them kind of storyboard it and script it. We were all out there at the state capitol for the shooting and we just offered suggestions, but we let them do the work on it. And, you know, we work together on these different projects and we just sit down and discuss how to deal with social issues, how to deal with being a social advocate, because what these young people are learning is that it's exhausting. And we stress that when you're exhausted from being a social advocate, don't share that on social media. Don't share that outside this little group that we have, because once you do, you'll have people who will say, see, I told you, it's exhausting to care. Mm-hmm. Like once you stop caring, you'll find yourself having a lot more energy and you'll encounter that stuff because you'll be heartbroken. And we've sat on Zoom calls where we've cried and shed tears over, you know, year 2020 recaps and isolation and quarantining and elections and insurrections and all of these different things that we've had to deal with over the course of the last, you know, month or so. We've talked about, or year or so, and we've talked about healthcare inequalities and all of these sorts of different things. And they're learning at a young age how exhausting this is, but they have all taken it on to be, you know, a part of their work, particularly on social media platforms. So that falls back into, you know, what we talked about at the beginning, in that media is no longer talking on the radio. Media is no longer being on television. If you're in media, you're some form of multimedia journalist, and that includes social media videos, that includes streams of what your radio show is, that includes radio, it includes podcasting, it includes all of those sorts of different things. So we work really closely with them in trying to help them balance all of that.
I think you bring up a really good point, and that's really grown and continues to grow the last 10, 20 years. And that's, you're right. If you have an existence now online and you have a conversation in whatever existence you're engaging with online, whether that's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or podcasting or whatever, that presence, that conversation follows you, and it almost makes, you know, a hypocrite out of every one of us at some point in time, or an ignorant statement comes out at any one point in time, because we're all ignorant, we're all hypocrites at the end of the day. It just depends on whether or not we learn from those moments in the future. And I think in media, which is we have a huge responsibility as professionals to teach up and comers in the industry, you know, the responsibility that you have is having a voice online, and what that means to those who are listening to what you are saying and what you are doing, but also the part that we don't see that happens as a result of that, right? Yeah. Words matter is something that we've heard, you know, since the dawn of time, and probably more so ad nauseum in the last, you know, few years, because we can see the vitriol that happens, and that's been happening for, you know, not just the last few years, but, you know, decades and centuries. Yet we still are in the cycle of treating others and talking about others in media and advertising still the same way. You know, here's a guilty confession. You know, I watch The Bachelor, you know, every now and then with my fiance, and even just watching some reality TV show, while it may be trash TV and perform some slight bit of entertainment, there's a lot of hate speech and bullying and, you know, slut shaming and all these other things that are happening on TV. Mm-hmm. So it really makes you take a step back and look at the industry that you're working in specifically, whether it is a podcast or just a Twitter handle that you're posting with every now and then, and look at the type of content that you're putting out. is it speaking to something that you want to be or have live on forever? Because at the end of the day, someone will respond to it and call you out or have a conversation with you about it. And it's important to at least understand the context of where that could be taken and how those conversations that you may not be having directly with a consumer one-to-one or an audience could be taken out of context and had with somebody else that's completely wrong or different. So just understanding that, I guess that responsibility more than anything is hard to communicate to someone who's new in the industry, because it's a very wide. All of a sudden, you grow up in a community of 100 people or 1,000 people, but now you're online and your community is all of a sudden potentially 7 billion people.
Mm-hmm.
So your voice all of a sudden echoes a lot further than just your initial 4 walls and a roof, and how to really understand that impact when you can't actually see it all the way through.
Yeah, there's definitely. I mean, social media classes need to be taught in high school. Like, it needs to be a part of
class like we used to have,
exactly.
Yep.
Yes, instead of learning how to play Dig Dug or do your multiplication tables on a floppy disk or whatever you did back in the fourth, like, social media needs to be taught. Like, it needs to be taught that, you can get on Snapchat and you think that video that you just posted is going to disappear after someone views it, but that's not how the internet works whatsoever. Like, you need to think twice before you send that. And there is jarring moments, even for me being in the radio business as long as I have, when you tweet something and it goes viral and you realize how many people actually saw what you just wrote, there's a very jarring realization to it, because with radio, while I'd love to believe millions and millions of people are listening on their phone all over the planet, I have no idea if a single person is listening. Like, whether you're in a studio or, as the case for me right now, is I'm in my house. I see my partner on the screen just like I see you. Like, this is how we have done our radio show since August. And we know people are listening. We can see a certain number on the live stream, but it doesn't really resonate like when you're doing radio, because it kind of just goes out there in the world. But when you tweet something and you open your phone again and you realize it's been retweeted 1,000 times or 10,000 times, and you start to realize, like, oh, that NFL coach that I was talking about saw this. Or a prominent NFL media member or NBA player saw it and either liked it or retweeted it or responded to it in one way, shape, or form. And it's a very jarring realization that, oh no, the internet, while I think my radio show can go out there to the entire world, while it very literally can, Twitter is an entirely different monster, and it catches quickly. Instagram is the same thing. It catches really, really quickly. And that's a realization that teaches you to conduct yourself a certain way on social media. Like, but my rule with people is always, if you're going to tweet about somebody, like if you're going to make a remark about somebody, how would you feel if that somebody read it? Did you convey your message in a proper way? How would you respond if that person that you're tweeting about responded to you? And I'm not talking about Trump, and I'm not talking about the vitriol that comes out. I'm talking about if you were tweeting about someone on The Bachelor, or, an actor, an actress, or an athlete, and they saw it and responded to you, or their fans saw it and respond. How would you react to that? So we really stress, when you word something, word it as if that person is in front of you and you're in a conversation with them. It's not nearly as sexy because, as you know, negative sells. Negative is which is why you see slut shaming and all of those different things on primetime television, because that's what sells. That's what draws the audience. But you can get much further in your social media dialogue if you veer away from that and you kind of focus on actual, it took a while to learn. It took a long time to learn, but I try to use social media as conversation tools rather than, some people use it as definitive statements. And I always think it's weak when people say they tweet something and then they don't check their mentions. It's well, you're a coward then. Get in, you basically made a statement and then you shut the door on it. Make a statement and have a conversation with it. And so I'm always like in my mentions trying to see, you know, if people disagree with what I wrote or what I said, and use it as an engagement tool, as a conversation tool. But man, that's work. That's like years of work, because your first reaction, you know, Twitter is so negative. Social media is so negative because when you see something that frustrates you or upsets you, the first thing you want to do is tell somebody. And if you're watching a game and your favorite player stinks, you want to go and you tweet, so-and-so stinks. He sucks. He's a bust. He's awful. And that's like Twitter is it's like a first reaction. I had a friend who used a great analogy. Like Instagram is your first date. Like you post your pretty pictures, like you primp up, like this is your big impression on somebody.
Yeah.
Twitter, you've been married like 40 years and you're just letting it all fly. And sometimes that's not a good thing to do. More times than not, it's not a good thing to do.
Stream of consciousness is a dangerous place because there's a lot that we think that we shouldn't say all the time. Doesn't mean right or wrong. It's good to think about all realms of things, but yeah, just understanding your audience ultimately, but also the reflection on yourself too. Because you're right, it's one thing to put out an opinion and not really want to respond. It's completely different to put out an opinion and then actually engage with that opinion. Because like they always say, opinions are like assholes. We've all got them. At the end of the day, it's so easy to be reactive because it's the easiest thing to do is to judge or to pass judgment or to just be negative. It's very hard to think positively for whatever reason. Maybe we're trained that way or we're raised that way, but forming positive conversations that build dialogue or engaging conversations are that much harder because we don't lead with that. That's not our initial reaction, is to lead with that type of narrative.
Well, social media has taught like insulation. Like you isolate yourself in a bubble of like-minded people. Like someone tweets something you like what do? You follow them. Someone finds out I cover the Sacramento Kings. What do? Well, they follow me because they love the Sacramento Kings and they want to hear, more about them. So you isolate yourself into this little bubble of like-minded people. It's very much the reason why we've seen things that we've seen so far in 2021 is because these people isolate themselves in this bubble in which they believe that reality is actually reality. And sometimes you have to get uncomfortable and break yourself out of that isolation and see and understand, or see and at least attempt to understand what other people are thinking and why they think that way.
100%. And I think, if there's a lesson that you could tell listeners in that vein, something that you would tell them to be considerate of as you're in this industry, how would you say, as a bit of advice going in or starting out in this industry, how do you approach that? How do you make sure that you're walking that line?
Ignore your first instinct. Like that's the first thing I would tell you. Just think it through here for a minute. Like Herm Edwards has a line, the football coach at Arizona State. He used to coach in the NFL. He has a great line because he may still speak to NFL rookies at the rookie symposium. And it's a famous line that's echoed every single year, every time a tweet goes out that shouldn't. Stop, don't, press, send. Think it over. Like, think about the emotional state that you're in right now. Because, when, January 6th, 2021, I'm in the middle of a show and I just glanced over at one of my screens here and saw an email pop up from my boss. He says, hey, and we have pretty free reign. They know who I am and what I stand for, and they understand, like, I've learned how to deliver certain messages. But the email was the title was in bold, and it was just, I need you to leave this alone today. Like, and we hadn't said anything about what was going on at the Capitol. And he was like, this is such a volatile situation. Just like, leave this. Like, we're getting flooded with emails from corporate about, unless we're a news station, avoid discussing this at all cost right now. You can address it tomorrow, but don't address it in this immediate moment. And it was like, we didn't have any intention to, barring something horribly, dramatic. And I mean, granted, what we saw was dramatic, but something that would cause everything to completely stop. We just kind of like let it go and acknowledge there was something going on and left it. So, it's you have to kind of take yourself out of that. And the reason they send those emails is because we're in a reactionary society. And it wasn't just pertaining to on-air discussion. It was pertaining to social media. And, my response was, and I emailed him right back. I was like, I know how to use my words. So I'm not going to pretend like nothing's happening, because that's not me. But that I know how to use my words. And so that's what I would encourage people to get into the business. That's what we encourage people to now. If you want to tweet about these issues that are going to be split, that in some cases people will seek out just to trash you about, word it in a way that you're comfortable in having a conversation with it. Like word it in a way that where someone who disagrees with you, who is sitting directly in front of you, can respond. Word it in that fashion. And your first instinct is to always be angry. Your first instinct is always to send off